So we'll be talking about brown rot. We got a couple of sessions in a row on brown rot. As I told Guido, I'm going to ask all the questions. He's going to give all the answers. So that's how we're going to approach this thing. But brown rot, if you're familiar, of course, with it, it is obviously one of our most dramatic diseases that we have on peach. And it, left to its own in our environment, you can have 100% loss in some years. It's definitely driven by rainfall and humidity, but we have major issues with it in Georgia and South Carolina and throughout the Southeast, pretty much anywhere peaches are grown. Now, as far as the ability to develop resistance, and our programs are designed to try to prevent resistance, brown rot is certainly one of the best fungi for doing that. We have these very large populations that occur in the field, a lot of multiplication, multiple cycles per year, extensive, very concentrated area of production in our peach growing regions. So you got a lot of inoculum just floating around and moving from orchard to orchard. We use a lot of fungicides for brown rot. That's also not great from the standpoint of resistance development. And then it also has a sexual cycle, which means it can actually adjust to new fungicides as they come through. And so it's one of the more susceptible fungi to develop resistance in general. Just going back a few years, I know that Will's going to be talking about some of his work, but we did do some surveys back in around 2006, 7, 8. The profile system that Guido had developed, we did that in Georgia, and so we got some information out of that. And what I'm going to tell you is it's amazing how things haven't changed that much even since those earlier surveys we did. This is just some of the results from looking just at DMI resistance itself. And what we determined, especially in the middle Georgia area, that it was very widespread. Okay, so that was what we got out of that. We knew we had a lot of DMI resistance. A lot of you growing peaches in middle Georgia had that. There's also a moderate shift to resistance in other areas that we saw, and we've since gone back in and looked at some of these regions, and they also have resistance. That has occurred. So we know that DMI resistance was very, very extensive throughout Georgia based on all those studies that were done. QI resistance we looked at as well, looking at some of the stuff that was like Impristine and Abound at that time, and it was pretty minimal. We did see a little bit of a shift there, but we didn't see it developing to any large degree. That was somewhat of a surprise, but we think there are reasons for that, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But again, a moderate shift. We determined that we should utilize these products sparingly to try to preserve them in the marketplace. The same thing is going to be true with the SDHIs, but we encouraged a lot of rotation with different modes of action. So that's how we determined we should use these products and also save them for brown rot. With the benzimidazoles, things like Topsin, which is the only one you really got out there at this point, strangely enough, we didn't see a lot of resistance at that time. Will's going to talk to you about where we are today, but by that time, where we had a lot of resistance in the past, we didn't see that much. So that was kind of interesting. And again, that's probably because we hadn't used it a whole lot. We kind of went away from it because there was so much resistance to it, and therefore it kind of dropped back into a natural state in the fungal population that the resistance level did. And we did at that time say you could use Topsin maybe once a year, but you have to be careful and always put it out with Captan, because we know that the pump is primed, so to speak, for that to come back pretty quick. So that's where we were, again, going back into 2009 with our results there. Now, I'm not going to give you a lot of information on these slides because Will's going to talk to you about his research, but what I do want to point out, if you look at this right here, if I can get my thing, that, 88.7 and 88.1% of South Carolina and Georgia isolates are resistant to DMIs now. So that is bad. There's a lot of DMI resistance out there. 2009, it was the same. Probably in 2000, it was largely the same. But that is what we have seen. It hasn't shifted that much. And then going back also, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but if you look at the studies that were done in 2008 and reported versus his, those look remarkably the same. So the DMI profile and what we're seeing right now looks a lot the same. So DMI resistance hasn't gone anywhere, but the good news is it hasn't gotten any worse, but it was already pretty bad to begin with. All right, so from this, information, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a bunch of slides that are just data sets where I'm going to point out why we developed this spray program that we have. And this is kind of the basic program for growing peaches as far as scab and brown rot management. It should cover some other things as well. But we try in the early season not to utilize anything that's going to be developing resistance. So we utilize things like chlorothalonil, we utilize sulfuricaptan, we utilize other products that can only be sprayed during bloom anyway. We try to make sure we don't develop resistance during that time frame. Then we come to the pre-harvest and we start bringing in other fungicides that we know can develop resistance, but they're more active. And we try to utilize as much as possible those modes of action only once, if at all possible. That's not always possible. We sometimes going to have to double up, but nonetheless, we try to minimize that. And then we have our post-harvest materials, such as the Scholar and Chairman. So we developed that system, and it's held pretty strong for us. Now, how did that come about? Well, going back, we do know that the DMIs, if you put them out at a high enough rate, and this is just based on some NDAR studies we did, if you look at increasing rates of NDAR, you can actually overcome DMI resistance. It's not something that is like the Topsin M resistance, where it's a plus minus thing. You either have control or you don't. You can actually increase the DMI rate and you can control it. You can sometimes introduce a different DMI and you may be able to control that resistance. Well, we found out that you could still increase the rate, use high rates of DMIs, and we could still use them to some degree. And that was one start to looking at what we wanted to do. Then also, if you look at the some of our studies we were doing at that time, we were able to see some things that were kind of interesting, because pristine had been introduced into the marketplace. That gave us something else to utilize. We've been so dependent on the DMIs. But if you look at this data, if you look at the, this is Propamax up top, so that's your DMI compared to your untreated. This is pristine followed by Propamax, so that's basically putting out a QOI, SDHI combo product, following it with the DMI, and it worked as well as putting out 2 applications of pristine. That's kind of where we got some of our thinking of how to apply these materials. We can still use the DMI. You can still get something out of it. You don't have to apply 2 back-to-back applications of the pristine. So that was one of our kind of things we learned. Here's another data set, and here you're looking at the Propamax and pristine, 2 applications, pristine just in the first spray, and then pristine followed by the Propamax. Again, if you look at this, you'll see that the pristine by itself ain't going to work. You know, we were just saying it's pristine that good by itself. Is that why when we follow it with the DMI, it still works, even where we have resistance? But it did not. So that was something we learned. But again, if you put out pristine, follow it with the DMI, it's the same as putting out 2 DMI applications, and we can still use the DMI for resistance as well and get good disease control. Enter the market with Maravon. So pristine was a very good fungicide until Maravon came along. And once we got Maravon, Maravon was a game changer as far as efficacy on brown rot. It's another QOI SDHI product, but it really did work better than pristine. So from this slide, that's what I want you to get out of this. If you look at the untreated control, you can see where your numbers are. Pristine, then your Maravons, and then Fontellus. So pristine and Fontellus are very, very similar, and that's what we would expect, okay? But that nonetheless, that was what we got out of that. So we started looking at Maravon more extensively and kind of went away from pristine in our studies at that point. But again, we're seeing some of the same things. So I just want to go back to some of the more recent data we have, looking at some of these combinations, and I'll key in with these highlighted areas so you can actually key in where I'm going. But here, if you look at Maravon or Maravon followed by Sevia in a study, and this is in Byron where we have DMI resistance. Maravon followed by Sevia is almost exactly the same as far as the disease control as you get with 2 Maravons. And we still are using DMI. If you go down below, this is from Clemson. This is Guido's data, and I don't know if there's any resistance there or not. I don't think it's necessarily reported there. But nonetheless, you see a similar type thing. You look at Maravon followed by tilt in that case, and compare that to the unsprayed down here. You can kind of see that the end result, and they're very much the same. So you can still use a DMI. Another data set, this is from flame prints in Byron, again, where we have resistance. Here looking at Maravon, here's your untreated, 85.6%. There's your Maravon twice, Maravon followed by Sevia. And I'll note too, I don't know if I do that here in the slides. I do actually. If you look at Sevia and Endar, this is what your DMIs by themselves are doing. And Endar, I showed you that slide where you could increase the rate of Endar and you could get control. I don't think even with the high rate of Endar we can get control at Byron now. And I've had other studies where we put it out, and I just don't like the control we get at all. So I even think that has shifted enough that we don't see the results with Endar that we used to at the higher rate. But I just want to show you these DMIs are not working there, are not working to the degree that I want them to work. But you can still use a DMI, the Sevia, with the Maravon. So again, this is part of our process of thought, our thought process and how we develop some of our resistance management thought process. All right, so this is 2021. Again, this is also at Byron, different trial, but looking at Maravon followed by Sevia. A little bit of a shift here, but not statistically different in any case at that point. Now we're starting to bring in these other chemicals that we're going to be talking to you more about today that cause us some degree of concern, but we have to think about how we're going to incorporate these things. So you've got on this bottom part, you've got LunaFlex and Luna Sensation. Well, Luna Sensation is a QOI SDHI similar to Maravon. So it does provide control that is comparable most of the time to Maravon. Maybe not quite as good, but pretty dang close most of the time. When you look at LunaFlex, now this is an SDHI DMI material. That's where our concern comes in, is we've got another DMI we're entering into the system where we may have DMI resistance. How do we utilize that? What are we going to do with that? Are we going to increase the DMI resistance to the point that we put more pressure on the SDHIs and then we have resistance to the SDHIs? That's the question that comes up. So as I said, I'm raising the questions. But nonetheless, you can't say it didn't work. This LunaFlex product is going to be, well, it's in the market, I think. You're also going to have other products like this that are coming into the market now. So we're going to have at least 2 or 3 of these types of products. So where do you utilize them? How do we incorporate those into your process of controlling brown rot? And what's going to happen with the resistance? Those are the questions we have. So going back to this is our current program, and I'm not going to tell you how we're going to incorporate those materials. I'm going to show you a little bit more data. But I'm just letting you know there's at least 2 or 3 of these that are coming to market. You're going to have one from Syngenta, one from Bayer, and one from BASF for sure, and there may be others. So there's going to be pressure on you guys to utilize these, and we just want to make sure we utilize them in the most efficient manner so we don't develop resistance if possible. All right, so studies the last couple of 2 or 3 years, I had several objectives for my brown rot study. Some of these were supported by the Georgia peach growers as far as the research. One, we did have that question that came up again. Is Maravon by itself going to be sufficient? Is that where we're getting this control? We put the Maravon out, put a DMI. Is really all the control coming from the Maravon? So that was a simple thing we could look at. And then we could also determine whether or not it was as active, again, looking at these DMIs and the Maravon compared to the Maravon by itself, just a general straight-up comparison. And then we also wanted to review any of the new materials that were coming into the marketplace, such as these DMI SDHI combos. So for this work, this is a standard scientific study. We do utilize air blast sprayers and standard farm equipment for these studies. So these are all done with standard farm equipment and at standard rates. We use a completely randomized design. We have all the fungicide treatments. We always have an untreated check. We take 5 replications of each treatment. We have 1 tree that we utilize for fruit harvesting. We take unsprayed rows between the trees so we don't cross-contaminate, so to speak, with the sprays. And then our cultural practices are generally the standard for the Southeast, except I will tell you this, if you look at our weed control, it's usually abysmal. But nonetheless, other than weed control, it looks pretty good. And then the fungicide applications we made at 14 and 7 days prior to harvest. We then harvest the fruit. We take 32 fruit, put them in a tray, and then watch them rot. And that's how we collect our data. So looking again at some of the results coming in, this is more recent data. Now this is from Byron, again, where we do know that we have the DMI resistance and pretty high level of it. If you look at your untreated control, this year we didn't have a huge amount of brown rot. But we also use what we call area under the disease progress curve. It helps you to kind of separate out some of these materials and look at them. But here again, if you look at the Maravon by itself or Maravon followed by Sevia, you don't get anything that's statistically different. And these trials, I've got quite a few trials where they're absolutely identical, and this is a little bit worse, but not statistically different at all. And then here's Maravon with just one application. And you can see that is not where you're getting all of your activity. So that starts to answer that question. We've done this again. Maravon is very, very good, but it's not that good. But it does certainly by itself control some of the brown rot. All right, so that's what we're seeing out of that. And then if you want to look at a few more things here, look at the Lunaflex, or the Lunaflex followed by the Sevia. Again, these products work right now, even where we have resistance. So again, our concern is how much pressure are we putting on the system where we have resistance on the DMI. But they do work. They're good products. The efficacy of these products is very, very good. That's why we have to talk to you about how you're going to incorporate them or utilize them. All right, again, this is actually not from Byron, this is Watkinsville, but similar results, just showing you some of the data we have there. I'm not sure that we have resistance in this location. We don't know that for sure, but we get similar results. If you look at Maravon, 2 applications, versus Maravon followed by Sevia, you can see they're somewhat similar in their AUDPC or in the percent infected fruit. Very, very similar. If you look at Sevia by itself, it's still not very effective. I mean, it's just not, these DMIs are not effective enough by themselves. Now again, I don't know if that's resistance has shown up there or if it's just they're not that good by themselves. But anyway, that's another example. If you look down below, Lunaflex followed by Sevia. Again, it is very good combination, very similar to what you would see with either Maravon by itself or Maravon followed by Sevia. So we're seeing the same type of response with these products, and they're very good products. All right, this is from this year, and you'd say, well, for those of you in Georgia, how did you get any brown rot data this year? We stripped every tree that we could find, basically. And if you look at the size of some of that fruit, we don't have to have size for brown rot. So we did have anything we could take in and put in a tray, but we got pretty good data out of it. So that's how we had some data. All right, looking at this last year. If you're looking at, again, Maravon, we've got Maravon in this case compared to Lunaflex or Luna Sensation. Again, pretty good disease levels. You know, we're up into the 70% range. It's hard to say there's any difference there. Okay, so I'm just saying these products are going to work. That Lunaflex, again, has the SDHI, DMI, and it works. My assumption would have been that maybe because of that DMI resistance, it just wouldn't look that good, but it looks really good. And then if you look, I wanted to just show you Inspire Super, and I've had a couple or 2 or 3 times Inspire's been up there. I'm not a big fan of Inspire Super, and I think the reason we're having problems with it in our case is because it does have a DMI in it, but its partner product is not sufficiently active on brown rot that we kind of get rid of that resistance problem. And so the Inspire Super in my hands in Middle Georgia has not been performing particularly well. So I'm just letting you know that, so keep that in mind for brown rot anyway. All right, another test, this is in Byron, also flame prints. Here you see Maravon followed by Sevia. Again, a little bit of an increase there, but not statistically different in that trial. Here's Sevia by itself. Again, I'm never happy with these DMIs by themselves in that situation. And here's one application of the Maravon. Again, it's showing pretty good activity with just one application. Not a very high level of disease by comparison, but you can see that Maravon is very active and has a long residual in activity, but it's not sufficient by itself. So just remember that. And again, looking at some of these other products, this is Reviloc. This is a similar product to what BASF will be bringing to the market, another SDHI DMI combo product. And if you look at Reviloc with Maravon or Reviloc by itself and compare it to two applications of Maravon, I mean, again, they're statistically not different and very, very similar. So this is yet another product that will be coming in that we think is going to be very similar to Maravon when it gets here. So going back over some of the things that we have learned, and I'll hopefully tie this in, and Guido and Will can talk about this too to some degree. But there have been quite a few papers that have come out in the time since we started looking at resistance in Georgia. The first one is the first paper that Guido published looking at our particular profile of resistance to DMIs in Georgia. And that came out in the early 2000s. Okay, so that was when we first realized that we had a good bit of DMI resistance in Georgia, and it was pretty extensive. So we knew that. From that, we are also able to later determine that with additional work, that we're seeing a little bit of a shift in the QIs. I mentioned that, but it wasn't dramatic. We're also able to see a little bit of shift in the SDHIs, but it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like we were losing the activity of these products. It was just a slight shift in the activity. And that's as far as that ever went. We've not ever seen a major problem with QI or SDHI resistance in Georgia yet. There's another paper that came out that said, and this is encouraging, that the mutation in monolinea that would confer like complete resistance in brown rot to the QI fungicides, things like in the QI will be in Maravon, Pristine, Abound, those products. That's not likely to happen because that particular mutation would kill the fungus. It would not do well. So that's good. That's new information that says that, okay, QI resistance is not as likely to happen in that way. We can still have a shift in resistance, but it's not likely to be a plus-minus thing where we have no control. So that helps us to think through, yeah, well, maybe we can maintain these QI-type fungicides a little bit longer if we're smart about it. So that's good. And then the bad part is that Guido did have another paper he published from South Carolina in which he did find some pretty strong DMI and SDHI resistance, but it was still more of that shifting type resistance. It wasn't like complete resistance. Well, we know this can occur. So all this kind of raises all these red flags for us about resistance. I hope that I can work for a long time with y'all, but I hope I either die or retire before you have brown rot resistance to that degree. That's what I'm hopeful for. So this is all very personal. It's about me. It's not about you. It's about me, because I don't know what to do if we get it. All right, and then last, I think but not least, just looking at some of these products, we got to go back. We've not really talked about Quadris Top, but this is another product we could possibly incorporate now as we start thinking about other products. We've never really promoted that or talked about it, but it actually also does work pretty well. And so this is yet another product we can go back in and look at how do we incorporate that. We're actually going to have more products, which that can't help but be good news. It's just trying to figure out how to make these work for you so that you have better efficacy, better control of brown rot, but you don't develop resistance. And of course, we've also got this animal coming out too, and this is anthracnose. And we can't just talk about brown rot. When we start applying these things in a vacuum talking about brown rot, we leave out the fact that also we can develop resistance in anthracnose. And when in the case of the QIs, we may be seeing a type of a complete resistance developing there. That may be why we're seeing more anthracnose. So we have to also think about some of these other fungi that are also out there in the field at the same time when we make up these programs. So with that, that's our standard program. I'm not going to change anything on that today. I'm going to let Guido talk to you about how we're going to change that if we change it at all. We can hopefully ask questions and give you answers as well. But that's still in place and it still works. Our question is, how do we make it better without increasing resistance? And that is what I have. I think I'm out of time. It's 9:29, but do y'all have a question? If not, oh, you got a question. Yes, sir.
When you say Maravon followed by Sevia, what is that actually?
Well, we put out the Maravon at 14 days prior to harvest and put out the Sevia at 7 days prior to harvest. Now, in some cases, you're going to have to put out, obviously, your peach harvest may be longer. You might have to put out another fungicide during the middle of harvest. But if we could keep you at 3 pre-harvest applications or in-harvest applications and use as many different products as possible, many different frac codes or modes of action as possible, that's what we're trying to do. Yes. Possibly. And I'm going to let Guido talk about it a little bit more. One of the things that we do know about the SDHIs is also the resistance is not complete. If you get resistance to one SDHI, it's not going to necessarily be 100% to the other ones. I think, and I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but I think the way to go on this thing may be to put out something like a Maravon, then something like a Reviloc next, where you have a DMI SDHI. And then the next question is, can we put another DMI, or do we have to go back to one of those other products so we don't build up the DMI resistance? But I think we could probably do something like a Maravon, then a Reviloc, and then if we need one more application, a DMI. But we need to test that, though. That's what we need to do next year, is actually look at that. Reviloc is not actually a registered product for peach. So we used that last year because that's what we had. But I don't know what the PHI is going to be on the new product they're bringing to market. I don't have any idea. It should be. Well, and I don't know that because, again, we're going to peaches from other commodities. They put that out on other commodities. It may be different. I shouldn't say that. I would hope it would be within the 7-day range, though, or maybe a 0 to a 1 day or something like that, but I don't know that. I would assume it would be, but I don't know that.
Pardon me.
Yes.
So on some of your results, you showed that there was no statistical difference between Maravon by itself and Maravon plus something else.
Followed by Sevia, yep.
But, I mean, just numbers-wise, it looked like one of them maybe had double the incidence, but it wasn't statistically significant.
Yes.
From a farmer's perspective, is that different enough to justify putting out 2 products rather than 1 product, because there's going to be more input costs?
Well, the thing that we're trying to do with that, and again, most of the time they're almost identical, but I do think you might lose a little bit by just putting out another DMI where you have strong resistance, because we're putting out where you have really strong resistance. We're also increasing our level of disease to such a high level. There's one row that's left every time unsprayed. We have untreated trees within the row. So the level of brown rot, I hope, is worse than any producer will ever see. So that puts pressure on the system. So something's going to fall out if it's there. I don't think commercial producers are going to see this because their disease control is so much better than what we're seeing because they're spraying all the trees. So I don't think you'd ever even see a difference. But you're right, there is a minimal difference sometimes between adding the Sevia as the second spray. I just don't think it's enough to worry about. And when you average it out, it may be real. It may be real. But overall, I think the risk of increasing resistance in the SDHI, maybe the QI, it makes me want to still put out that DMI fungicide. Okay. I will turn it over to Guido.
Thank you. Okay, I haven't even scanned my badge. Thank you so much, Phil. That was a great introduction. And I can't stress enough, really, how important it is to apply resistance management in addition to disease management in peach orchards here in South Carolina and also in Georgia. Resistance is a big issue, will be a big issue and probably will become more of an issue, as we will see in the next 60 minutes or so, because there are some tighter restrictions coming that will have an influence, a negative influence on our ability to actually manage resistance. And once brown rot develops resistance to the 3 chemical classes that we basically have to control it, we're going to be in trouble. We're going to be left with spraying maybe Captan during pre-harvest season. And we don't want this to happen, and I'm putting all my energy behind this to make sure that this is not happening. So what Monilinia fructicola can do in peach is it can actually produce 3 different diseases. It can produce blossom blight initiated by sexual spores produced by the fungus in the spring. It also can be caused by conidia produced by the mummies early in the season. So blossom blight is the #1 disease. The fungus can also produce green fruit rot. Fortunately, green fruit is not that susceptible to this pathogen, and so most of the time what happens is that the pathogen will disperse its conidia on the fruit, and it will then produce what we call latent infections. It will just going to sit there in the first few layers of the peach and wait for better days when the peach actually incorporate sugars and become more susceptible to the disease. And then it produces what we all know to be brown rot on mature fruit, pre-harvest brown rot and post-harvest brown rot. So we are using an integrated approach to make sure that we can manage this disease. And that's important because we can't just rely on chemicals themselves. The reason why we're doing all this integrated stuff is we're reducing the population size. By reducing the population size, we reduce the diversity of the fungus, and that reduces the chances of resistance development. So we do this by improving canopy airflow and limiting short distance spread, by pruning and thinning. We're doing this by removing the mummies and the cankers from the trees when we prune. We're also doing this by applying insecticides because insects are vectors of the disease. So all this needs to be done in order to reduce population size. But in the end, really, we are reliant on pesticides to control brown rot when it comes to pre-harvest and post-harvest brown rot. Now, there's 2 different major classes or categories of fungicides available to us. One are the multisides and the other one are the single-site fungicides. And as the name already suggests, the multi-site fungicides are the ones that act upon multiple sites in the fungus, not just a single site. So that makes them much less vulnerable to resistance development. These multi-site fungicides are your Captan, your chlorothalonil, and your Thyram, for example, or Xyram in this case in peaches. So we apply them and they stay on top of the leaf, they stay on top of the fruit, they don't penetrate, they have protective activity. They're only effective at high dose, unfortunately. We have to spray them in pounds per acre or quarts per acre rather than ounces per acre, which makes them a little bit more to be concerned about due to higher toxicity profiles, right? You're spraying more of that poison that affects multiple sites in an organism. But the great thing about multisites is they're not vulnerable to resistance development. I have yet to see one single example where Monilinia fructicola would have developed resistance to like Captan or chlorothalonil. The single-site fungicides, on the other hand, they are protective and they're used protectively and curatively. So they can actually penetrate into the leaves or into the fruit to a certain extent and can be used even after an infection event has occurred. That's a big difference to the multisides. They're effective at very low doses, at ounces and mils per acre, and they have one single mode of action. That means they only affect like one enzyme in the fungus, and oftentimes that enzyme is specific to fungi and is not really the same as the enzyme that we have, for example, so it's much less toxic. But the unfortunate thing is, with this advantage comes a disadvantage that these single-site fungicides are vulnerable to resistance development. And Monilinia fructicola is vulnerable to resistance development to all of those chemicals that Phil has mentioned, the 7s, the 11s, even though there's some exceptions to the 11s, but they're also capable of producing high levels of resistance to DMI fungicides, as shown in some Brazilian studies. And that's something that also my student will address a little bit later. So there's a lot of potential that we need to act against. Now, EPA regulations as part of this FIFRA Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, has to investigate each chemical every 15 years. So when they come up for re-registration, everything is being put on the table, and they look at what chemicals are of unacceptable concern and whether or not these chemicals need to be removed from the market or whether the use pattern needs to be changed. Now, currently, Captan is under scrutiny, chlorothalonil is under scrutiny, Thyrem, Mancozeb, all these chemicals are under scrutiny. I think for strawberries, we're going to lose Thyrem and Xyrem. So that's going to come. With regard to peach, the two chemicals that are of your concern would be Captan and chlorothalonil, and I think we're going to be okay. With regard to Captan, there will be some restrictions. I think we will see a cancellation of the formulations that are not liquid, that are dust-based because of safety concerns. And we will also see a reduction in rate of Captan. So, for example, per application, we will no longer be able to use 4 pounds of active ingredient per application, but rather it's going to be reduced to 3 pounds. So I think we're going to be okay with this. With regard to chlorothalonil on peach, it looks like that we're going to be restricted to 2 applications, which is probably what most of you do anyway. You don't use more than 2 as far as I know. And that is because for sandy or coarse textured soils with less than 2% organic matter content, where the water table occurs at a depth about 30 feet or less from the surface, that's where this major restriction will apply. And that is probably what is going to happen, that we're going to be restricted to 6.2 pounds of chlorothalonil per acre per year. So that would be 2 applications at the full rate. With regard to single site, so in other words, there will be some restrictions on multi-sites, but fortunately this time around, the restrictions we can absorb, I think. Now, in 15 years, this might change, and they will look at it again. We'll see what then happens. With regard to single-site fungicides, the restrictions are not quite as harsh. Maybe we're going to lose 1 or 2 members of a FRAC code, but no FRAC code is going to disappear. But new modes of action haven't been developed very much over the last 20 years. In fact, I think Pristine, like the FRAC 7s, was the last one to really be a new chemistry. Everything after that were sister products like Mary Vaughan, Luna Sensation. Those are all very similar, or the same mode of actions and similar chemistries. And as we will see a little bit later, there will be little incentive really for the chemical companies to produce more new chemicals because the European Union and also California, they're moving away from a lot of conventional products. They're moving away into more green direction. So there's much less incentive for chemical companies to produce new products that they can't sell anymore. Fludeoxonil might be the only exception that I can see may be available to us during pre-harvest season. Fludeoxonil is one of these compounds that is in Chairman. It's highly effective against monilinia, and there is talk about maybe registering that for pre-harvest season as well. But I haven't yet seen a product that is actually registered, but there's talk. So with regard to the spray program, and Dr. Brennan has gone over this already, it is super important that we use our single-site fungicides, or the ones with the single number, the FRAC 1s and 2s and 7s and 11s, those guys, that we use them really as little as possible and strategically, even better in mixtures. So we're promoting to not use any of the fungicides that we're using here during pre-harvest season during bloom. I think here we're good with the FRAC 2s and 9s. Then we're moving into the area of scab control. No, this doesn't work anymore. Scab control and green fruit rot control. And usually we use multisides like chlorothalonil or Captan during that season. So that doesn't select for resistance, which is good. And in the past 15 years, or 20 years actually, we've used the FRAC 7 and 11s as a first pre-harvest spray. And we did this for reasons that Phil has already pointed out. The 7-11s have just excellent activity, and the residual effect throughout pre-harvest season, reaching into post-harvest season, is excellent, especially Mayor Vaughn and Luna Sensation. So it's much better than what we had in the past. And so for that reason, we're still pretty comfortable spraying the DMI fungicides as a second chemical or chemistry at the high rate, though, because as we have found out 15 years ago, the low rate doesn't really work any longer for considering the resistance situation that we have. So we're using that and then followed up maybe after the first pick with another 7-11. Now the question then also becomes, how do we fit those new mixtures into our program? And those are the mixtures that I have found so far that probably are registered already: Mirvis Duo, Luna Flex, Quadris Top, and Inspire Super. Phil has talked about those already. And what you might notice is that these mixtures all have the FRAC 3s in them. There's the 3 right here, 3, 3, 3, and even that one, Luna Experience 3. So the DMI fungicides, which are the FRAC 3s, are still critically important to us. We have to make sure that we will maintain their efficacy as much as we can. They're being recycled, so to say, in these mixtures with 7s and with the 11s and with the 9s. The other aspect here is I looked at the rate of these 3s in these mixtures. The rate can't be where it's no longer effective against the monolinias that have developed resistance. So the rate in all of those is okay. That rate will control your resistant isolates, whereas in Luna Experience, according to my math, we don't get enough tebuconazole to actually control our strain. So that would be one that I wouldn't use in the Southeast, especially not in Georgia where we have so much resistance going on. But those are good to use. So how do we use them? I think the three 9s, I think they can be used very well as a second application after a 7 and 11 over here in pre-harvest season. So don't use them anywhere else, just use them once over here. So 7-11 followed by the 3-9s. Now, 3-9, as Phil already mentioned, that's Inspire Super. And according to his data, it's not quite as effective as the 3-7s. So if you do choose to use the 3-9s, you would have to follow up with another strong material afterwards. So that's the drawback here. More effective are the 3.7s, Miravis-Duo and Luna Flex. I really like the results that come out of Georgia. They look very convincing. So spraying them right after a 7-11, I think will be really, really good. And the two together, sprayed one after another, I think will knock down the population enough to comfortably recommend a single high dose of a Frac 3 after the first pick or so. So that should really be a good program without selecting for resistance. Yes, we're spraying the Frac 3s 2 times in a row, but 1 time in a mixture with the 7, and then we have really a very low population size that shouldn't affect any selection process to the DMIs. The 3.11s, that would be your Quadris top. Again, you can spray that at the second time around during pre-harvest season, and that can also be followed by a single application of a Frac 3 at the high rate. So I think all of those are good examples of how we can manage resistance. Now, I'm going over time here a little, but we need to look at the DMI resistance, and we need to make sure that we are not developing any resistance that is of a qualitative nature, meaning of a nature where we can't use the DMI fungicides at all any longer. Those would be based on point mutations. Right now, we don't have any point mutation-based resistance. So that's what Will is going to talk about here in a little bit. And you might still remember Dr. Zehr, my predecessor. He worked a lot on MBC resistance in the past, and he looked at Frac 1s, the tops and Ms and Benomyl, and the work that Will has done is directly linked also to looking at this old chemical and whether or not there's a potential maybe for us to integrate it in future programs for resistance management purposes. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Will and ask him to present some of his master's research.
All right, thank you, Dr. Schnabel. So I'm going to be echoing some of the stuff that was brought up in Dr. Brandon's, but what this basically and what I'm going to be presenting to you today is a massive overview of a resistance profile for the Southeast. Specifically looking at the 2 groups, which are the DMIs, and I looked at propiconazole for research purpose, and then one that hasn't been used in a while, which is the MBCs, specifically thiophanate methyl. And some of you are probably more acquainted with Benomyl, which is very similar. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at the propiconazole and the DMIs, and then we'll move on to the MBCs. A little background of what the DMIs actually do. It basically inhibits ergasterol synthesis, and ergasterol is what makes the fungal cells strong and give it structure. But if you don't have that, you're not going to make a good cell, you're not going to grow. And how it specifically works is in the assembly line for making ergasterol. Let's see, this guy works sometimes. In the assembly line for making ergasterol, our DMIs cut in right here and stop the process. And that's how they work. And the DMIs are one of our oldest conventional fungicides that we still currently use. So with that being said, there is some known resistance. I'm not going to go too much into this. We know that the resistance is caused by overexpression of the gene that makes that our DMI goes after, and it is caused by something called the MONA element. And previously mentioned, our last major survey for the DMI fungicide resistance was done in 2004, so it's about time that we give you all another overview. So that's exactly what we did. The first portion of today is going to be, we're going to be looking at screening resistance for DMI fungicides. And then we're also going to go over looking at MONA and the presence throughout the Southeast, and if there's any new mechanisms of resistance we have to be worried about. So for this survey, we looked at 3 states, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. We tried getting at least 50 isolates from each state, and we tried getting it from at least 5 counties of major peach production. And then this study totaled about 238 isolates, so that's about 238 peaches swabbed. So without further ado, how did we determine our resistance profile? we use something called a discriminatory dose assay. And what that assay is, it discriminates between sensitive and resistance. So we took that swab from that rotten peach that we swabbed, and we take one spore from it, and then we grow it out and we put it on a plate that has a specific amount of fungicide. In this case, it was 0.3 ppm of propiconazole. And then we let it grow and we compare it to a plate that has no fungicide in it, and then we can get a relative growth. If that relative growth is above 20%, that would indicate either reduced sensitivity or resistance. And you've seen this earlier, but just a little more overview on this. Everything that you see to the right of this red bar would indicate reduced sensitivity or resistance. And we say reduced sensitivity because the DMIs still work to a degree, but just not as much in these categories up here. And then everything to the left is what would be considered sensitive. For Alabama, we see that about 16.2% of the isolates that we collected are resistant. And this is actually a first report for resistance in Alabama. So yes, it is present there, but it's not very much like South Carolina and Georgia, which are in the upper 80s. And we already knew about this. This has been long standing. So the question is how much has that shifted from, say, the early 2000s? And that's where we compared an older paper. You also saw this. We can see that in general, everything looks pretty similar between this purple bar and this orange bar from 2008 and 2021 and 2022. So our spray programs are, in general, working to not increase the amount of resistance or increase the levels and categories of resistance present in your fields. So next, we're going to see if there's any new mechanisms of resistance that we have to worry about, and if MONA is still the major cause of that resistance. If you're wondering what the MONA element is, basically in a normal and a sensitive isolate that we collect, this arrow is a gene. It makes that enzyme that DMIs go after, and if you put on your DMI, it's going to control it normally. But with the addition of MONA right before that gene, it produces a lot more of this enzyme, which then equates to mean you have to put down more DMIs. And so more DMIs, not really profitable. This is just how we were able to determine MONA. This is just a genetic test that we do. And what we were able to find is that in 94.44% of our sensitive isolates, it did not have MONA. There were some oddball ones, but that was because it was at that threshold of being resistant. On the other case, every single resistant isolate we had MONA, which this indicates for us that MONA is still the primary resistance factor for Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia. So nothing new has popped up that we have to worry about with the DMIs. So just for the DMI ending, reduced sensitivity and resistance still present in South Carolina and Georgia. For Alabama, sorry, we got a first report for you guys. For the current resistance levels, it has not increased since 2008 a lot, which is something good. We know that our spray programs using DMIs is still working. We're not gaining anything which is out of control. And then also, MONA is the primary cause of resistance. Nothing new for you guys, which is good. And what does this mean for now? Our current spray programs are working, at least for the time being, with DMIs. We can still use them as we saw in Dr. Brannon's and what we looked at now. And also, in my study, I use propiconazole, such as products like Tilt and Propamax, but we have more effective DMIs that are already out there, such as Tebuzol, Indar, and we also talked about Quadris Top, which is one of those mixtures. So moving on to the MBCs, this one is something that we were really interested in because we haven't used it in a very long time, because we don't really recommend it. How this fungicide works is that it goes after something called beta-tubulin, and beta-tubulin helps cells divide. If you can't divide your cell, you're not going to grow, the fungus dies. And this was one of our first classes that we used for conventional fungicides way back in the 70s, and then we drastically reduced the use in the early 2000s, and that was because of widespread resistance. We overused this in the 80s and 90s, and what happened was a mutation in this beta tubulin gene happened. And basically what that means is that mutation, no matter how much MBCs you put on there, it is not going to inhibit this fungus. It's going to grow. And we know that the mutation is specifically caused by E198A. That's what was in the southeast and what had been reported. So our objectives is to now determine the efficacy of thiophanate methyl, our MBC of interest, using discriminatory doses assay, what I talked about earlier, and detached fruit, because we want to see how it works on the fruit. And then also to determine if there's any new modes of resistance present that we have to be worried about. And then we also just want to see, can we mix MBCs with another product to potentially in the future rotate this back in as another tool in the toolbox, add in another frat code for you guys. Again, discriminatory dose, we talked about this. The only difference between this one and the last one is the doses themselves. So we have 1 and 500. 1 is a very low dose for moderately sensitive testing, and 500 is for that complete resistant testing. And then the other thing is if there was any growth at all, that indicated resistance. We also use some genetic stuff to determine what kind of resistance it was. Not as important for time's sake. So looking at Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia, 70.6% of all the isolates tested from these 3 states were sensitive, which is very different from what we saw in the early 2000s, which would have been on the other side of this graph. So again, everything to the right is considered moderate. These guys are considered moderately sensitive. All of these guys are considered sensitive. And all the way over here, of those 233 isolates that we tested, 3 of them had complete resistance. And 1 of them was at a research orchard. So looking at this again in a little pie form, that 1.3, that's the complete resistance. That's the mutation we knew about prior. Not found very much. 70.6% is a bunch of sensitive. And this 28.9%, that is moderately sensitive. It means that it's just, the MBC just doesn't work a little bit, but it still can control it. And we want to know what about those moderately sensitive ones that are in your fields. We wanted to test the high label rate of thiophanate methyl, our MBC. And we did that using a detached fruit. And basically what we did, we sprayed peaches with the high label rate of thiophanate methyl, and then 1 with water. We added the fungus to the peach, and then after a couple days of growth, we compared the non-sprayed peach to the sprayed peach. And if you can see this picture right here, this is a sprayed peach, and this is a non-sprayed peach. And what you get is, if you're looking at the different sensitivities, you got sensitive, moderately sensitive, and high resistant. If you're looking, you'll see that only the high resistant ones grew at the high label rate of thiophanate methyl. All the moderately sensitive ones were controlled with a high label rate, and all the sensitive ones were as well. And we saw this within big red peaches, and we also saw this in June prints. It's the same exact thing twice. Only the high resistant ones grew at the high label rate of thiophanate methyl. But we also wanted to see how this worked in the field as a mixture. So that's exactly what we did. We mixed Topsin 4.5 fluid with Abound, which is azoxystrobin, and Kenja, isofetamide, QOI, and an SDHI. And what we were able to find is that for June Princess nectarines, compared to the grower standard Maravon, which we talked a little bit about today, is that at harvest, this is at harvest 0, you see that the Topsin and Abound and the Topsin and Kenja were very similar. These bees have very similar. And we had a lot of brown rot that year, so you can see that it controlled it pretty well. And then when you go into 3 days post-harvest, you see that same trend where statistically the same as Maravon afterwards, and a lot of brown rot in the uncontrolled, as well as 7 days. We also tested this on June prints Sadly, that was a year of not a lot of brown rot. That's kind of bad for us pathologists. At 6 days, but we still see the same trend. A little bit of brown rot formed in the untreated, and then in the treated ones, we see statistically the same compared to Maravon and our combinations with MVCs. And this is the same for 9 days post-harvest as well. So to finally overview this, resistance to MVC fungicides, specifically Topsin M, it went down a lot. It's no longer a major concern for us, with less than 2% of the Southeast having complete resistance. Another is that the E198A mutation is the only mutation that we really found. We didn't gain another one that we have to be worried about. And that the sensitive and moderately sensitive can still be controlled by a high label rate of the MVC fungicide thiophanate methyl. And then lastly, with very careful integration of this fungicide potentially in the future, we can rotate in another frac code, relieving some stress off of the 7s and 11s for a future date, because we know those guys work so well. And that is all that I have for you guys. Hopefully not over too much time. And if you guys got any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
All right, we're
Okay.
ready for Vito again.
Great, thank you. So this is again 30 minutes that I would like to share with one of my students to give her credit for all the good work that she did. Same deal as with Will. And I would like to talk a little bit about the European and Californian push for drastic pesticide reduction and how I think that might actually influence what we're going to have to do in the future, and how my research program at Clemson University is trying to address this. So Europe is actually taking drastic action into making Europe a green economy. So this is Ursula von der Leyen. She's the European president, European Union president, and she announced in 2019 the European Green Deal. It's a huge deal that has the goal to make Europe carbon neutral. And there's a whole bunch packed into this goal. It's, they want to be climate neutral. They want to have a green economy. They want to increase biodiversity, clean energy, and so on. So it's a huge ambition that also moves into agriculture. Now, the agricultural section of this huge European Green Deal is called the Farm to Fork strategy. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. But because this is such an ambitious project by the European Union, it was marked as the Europe's man on the moon moment. So that's how important they think it's going to be. Now, the European Green Deal is really going to touch every single sector of the European Union, including transitioning financing into the European Green Deal. So they're going to have a European Climate Bank. They're going to have investment plans. So a huge funding structure for making this all happen. They're going to look at reliable and clean energy. They're going to look at achieving climate neutrality, sustainable transport, making sure that diversity is increasing, zero pollution, so zero carbon emissions. Do I need? Okay, sorry. There's only so many things I have to look at my slide and also talk into the mic. So a whole bunch that goes into this, including the Farm to Fork strategy, which is related to agriculture right there. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more. So the Farm to Fork strategy is or has the goal to increase organic farming in Europe. It will reduce food waste, it will promote sustainable ag practices, improve animal waste, and more and more and more. But really the key element here for specialty crop producers in Europe, such as apple producers, peach producers, strawberry producers, is a 50% reduction of pesticide risk and pesticide use by the year 2030. That's only like in 6 years. By the year 2030, they will have to reduce pesticide risk by 50%, and they're not going to stop there. They will set new rules, new goals after 2030 to reduce yet that to another degree, to another percentage. So I think at some point they want to do completely without synthetic pesticides, if that is at all possible. They're also going to look at artificial fertilizers and antibiotics used in agriculture, and they're drastically reducing that as well. So California is actually following that same trend, and you might have heard about the California Roadmap to Sustainable Pest Management, and basically what that was, or what that is it's initiated by the California Department of Pesticide Regulations. They summoned 30 plus people from all sections of agriculture, like growers and chemical companies and regulators and everybody, and they locked them in for 2 years, basically in a room, and threw away the key, and they didn't let them out before they agreed on something so that they all could sign off. And they came up with this roadmap over here, and it's supposed to build on IPM, so it's not like totally organic. It's supposed to build on IPM, but I would call it maybe a green IPM solution. And the focus here, according to that roadmap, is the focus on human health and equity, on environmental protection, and on the economy. Now, there are two major goals that need to be, or that they want to achieve. One is California will have eliminated the use of priority pesticides by transitioning to sustainable pest management practices, and two, sustainable pest management will be adopted as the de facto pest management system in California. So that's supposed to be the norm rather than the exception. So the key two words here are priority pesticides. What in the world are these priority pesticides that will be on the chopping block? So according to what I figured out is they define the priority pesticides as the ones that have acute toxicants, that are carcinogens, that are endocrine disruptors, that are developmental and reproductive toxicants, and that impact water, air, flora, and fauna. Now, I don't know any of the chemicals that we're using that does not have an impact on water, air, flora, and fauna. So I don't know what they're talking about, but that is their definition. Now, there is a disclaimer to the whole thing. So the disclaimer is there will be some criteria applied. So the criteria would be what the hazard and risk classification is of these priority pesticides, whether or not there are alternatives, viable alternatives to these pesticides, and whether or not there's a high-risk pest management situation at play. For example, I could imagine Pierce's disease of grapes. You know, if you can't control the vectors, you will have Pierce's disease of grapes, and with the Pierce's disease of grapes, you won't have any grape production anymore in California. So I think that's what they talk about when they talk about high-risk pest management situations. So who will decide what these priority pesticides are? And that is the big question that everybody's asking. So here again, the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, they will assign people to a committee, to an advisory committee, and they will probably do the same thing that they did before. They will lock them all up for 2 years and don't let them out until they come up with some sort of a priority list that they can all agree on. So this is what's happening right now. And so the question is, how does that influence us here in South Carolina, in Georgia, and in the entire southeastern United States? Now, it is certainly hard to predict the future, and I don't know if they're going to be successful. If they are successful, there might be a trickle-down effect to other states who might also implement a similar roadmap. But looking at this, I can already tell you that the agricultural companies are putting more resources into the development of biological control agents, into the development of grass products, like grass are called, that stands for generally recognized as safe products. And there is, to my knowledge, less resources being put into development of synthetic pesticides. And that sort of makes sense, because if they can't sell their produce or their products anymore in Europe or in California to major economies, then there's less incentive to develop these things. Also, if you attend worldwide conferences, like in Europe or Asia or wherever you're going to go, there's just an immense number of talks offered to the audience that talk about the use of biocontrol agents, the use of alternative products to control pests and diseases. Also, I'm editor of the journal Pesticide, Biochemistry and Physiology, which traditionally has dealt a lot with resistance management, with the efficacy of synthetic pesticides. Probably 80% of the papers I'm getting now that are related to diseases are related to biocontrol agents and essential oils and bacillus and pseudomonas and whatnot. So there's a huge push. There's also a huge push towards developing new technologies that could meet these needs. And the new technologies are these peptides, these antimicrobial peptides. So there's several companies trying to develop those, and spray-induced gene silencing via RNAi, double-stranded RNAi applications. Those are small nucleotides that induce a suppression of certain genes of the pathogen and kill the pathogen that way. There's also more research going into systemic acquired resistance or induced systemic resistance. Those are compounds that you spray to the plants to activate their own immune system. They have in the past not really worked very well for trees, but they work actually pretty well for other crops, strawberries, for example, or vegetables, or these kinds of things. And in addition to this, we've got the FIFRA mandated 15-year re-registration mandate, where we can expect tighter rules on these multicides. The Captan and the chlorothalonil, we talked about this already. I think Xyram and Thyram, they're going to be canceled. I think that's a pretty much done deal. And all of this will certainly impact fungicide resistance management. And the reason being is we have fewer choices, fewer rotation partners to work with, and all of those things. So in summary, the major economies in the European Union and California, they are implementing regulations to massively reduce pesticide risk over the next years and decades. And I think that these broad market forces, they may increase the demand for reduced pesticide produce. So that's what we will have to deal with, I think, in the next few years. The major ag companies are already adapting. They're pushing more resources into these greener pesticides. And I think this whole story about re-registration, more demands on safety, less availability of frac codes, all that will reduce the lifespan of the existing chemicals that we have available to us now, the 7s, the 11s, the frac 3s, because we have little to rotate them with. And for that reason, research that Will has done is very important. We're trying to reactivate some of the old chemistries and maybe rotate them in to extend the lifespan of existing products. So that might help us. And also, I think we will have to figure out how we can reduce pesticide risk in South Carolina and Georgia peach orchards, just as a means to stay competitive in looking forward in what's to come. So that's where Johanna is going to tell us a little bit about her research. I think there might be some ways and some time points where we can use these products to reduce pesticide risk. There's also probably some ways where we can make these biologicals, which historically haven't really worked very well, more effective. And Johanna is going to talk to you about this one as well. Where we will start testing those greener products will be during bloom. I think there's an opportunity here because all we have to protect is the flower, the stamen, and the stamen in particular. So the stamen is or can be protected by biological control agents because it contains nutrients that can support biological control agents. So that has been shown really well in apples, where they can protect from fire blight infection, for example. And I think we can also look at substituting some captan sprays during green fruit rot development or during the cover sprays without losing any efficacy and without taking on additional risks that might impact the fruit quality that we desire. So with that, I'm just going to hand it over to Johanna, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about the ongoing research to find alternative products to captan.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Schnabel. So as we just heard, there's a demand to drastically reduce the amount of our chemical fungicides in our spraying programs. So, but the question is, how can we reduce the amount of chemical fungicides and successfully control diseases like brown rot at the same time? So I will try to find some answers today. And as we already heard, one possible approach could be the use of biocontrol agents. So what are actually biocontrol agents? Those are microorganisms that we can find in the natural, is it working? No. That we can find in the natural environment of our plants, and they can have an impact against plant pathogens. So, for example, they can produce antimicrobial metabolites and also compete with them against nutrients in space. They can induce resistance mechanisms in the host plant and also promote the plant growth. And this has, on the other hand, an impact for the susceptibility for infections. So in my research, I'm specifically working with two biorational fungicides, Howler, that is based on a bacteria Pseudomonas chlorophyll, and the other one is Tia, is based on a bacteria Bacillus subtilis. Those biorational fungicides can include the metabolites, but also the cells. But as we already heard, the problem with those fungicides is specifically for fruit crops, there are several studies that indicate under field conditions they are not satisfactory. So we need to find ways to make them more consistent and reliable to improve the efficacy. And our idea was, okay, let's see if we can find some compatible mixing partners and search for synergistic effects between the fungicides. So as we already heard today, DMI fungicides are the main used, most important fungicides for control brown rot. And the idea was, okay, let's combine DMI fungicides with BCAs and see if we can get some control efficacy for brown rot. So when we talk about DMIs, we know there are different DMIs. So you can see in this table the most used DMIs for fruit crops. But today in my presentation, I will only focus on the first one, on propiconazole. But if we want to combine a DMI with a BCA, there are different questions that we need to answer. First of all, which DMI fungicides are compatible mixing partner for our BCAs? Because it could be that the DMI fungicide has maybe an inhibition effect on the BCA, and we don't know if there are differences between DMIs. Also, we need to find the right dose for mixing the DMI with the BCA. And another question would be, are there differences between fungicide formulations of the same active ingredient? So you must imagine for propiconazole, for example, we can have a product that's Propistar, what is an oil-based EC formulation, but also Mentor, that's a vegetable powder you can see on this photo. And we don't know if this all can have an impact on our biocontrol agent, so let's try to figure this out. I will just go briefly over some studies that I have done in the last months. And we can see here on this photo cultivated a nutrient broth, in this case Bacillus subtilis, and I added different concentrations of propiconazole. So then I incubated everything for 24 hours on a shaker, and we can see in the control, in the 0 ppm and also in the lower concentrations, 10 and 50 ppm, the nutrient broth got cloudy. So that indicates there was a vegetative cell growth of the biocontrol agent. But when we look into the higher concentrations, 100 and 150 microgram per milliliter, we can see the nutrient broth is still clear. So that indicates there's probably an inhibition effect, and we need to reduce the dose of our DMI fungicide when we want to mix this with the BCA. And as I already mentioned, there's also an impact of the fungicide formulation by itself. So you can see in this figure the optical density detected over 24 hours when we use the dose of 50 microgram per milliliter propiconazole for 2 different fungicide formulations. So you can see, okay, 0 ppm compared to the WP formulation, there is already a delayed growing. But when we look at the EC formulation, the inhibition effect is way stronger. So this is very interesting and shows us, okay, we need to find the right dose and also the right fungicide formulation for combinations. So with this knowledge, we thought, okay, let's try to see if we can find some control against brown rot. And specifically for brown rot, howler is recommended. So that's why we added a dose of 50 microgram per milliliter propiconazole with the right fungicide formulation, and started some detached root studies. In this case, I used apple, because apple are the whole year available and also very susceptible to brown rot. And I wounded those apples with a toothpick and sprayed them with the fungicides. And after 24 hours, I inoculated them with the spore suspension of Monilinia fructicola. And 5 days later, I evaluated the lesion radius, and in addition, I calculated the synergistic effect. So what's the synergistic effect? When we spray the fungicides for itself, we can, based on the results, calculate the control, what we would expect. And if we have the results for the combination of our 2 fungicides, the observed control, and the observed control is higher than that what we would expect, we have a synergistic effect. If the observed control is lower than that what we would expect, it's an antagonistic effect. So we can see here my results that I got, and you can see the inoculated control compared to howler and the reduced dose of propiconazole. There was no significant effect, but we can see the combination howler plus propiconazole significantly reduced the lesion radius of Monilinia fructicola. And also the green number, what you can see there, indicates us a high synergistic effect between our fungicides. So we thought, okay, that's a very interesting finding, but can we apply those findings into the field? So therefore, we used the same treatments as in the detached root study, but in addition, we added a grower standard, what is the usual field dose of propiconazole. And we had four trees in a full randomized block design. And we applied the fungicides 2 and 1 week before harvest. And then on the day of harvest, we went in there and counted 100 fruit per tree and evaluated the brown rot incidence. And also, in addition, we collected 56 symptomless fruits and evaluated the post-harvest brown rot incidence 3 and 7 days later. So we can see here the results from the brown rot incidence in the field. So we can see the untreated control compared to our treatments. There was no significant effect, and only the grower standard worked a little better. But when we look into the results for the post-harvest brown rot 3 days later, it's getting very interesting because we can see, okay, the biorational fungicide howler compared to the untreated control, there was no significant effect. We can also see we had a very high disease pressure, almost 60%. But when we look into the combination howler plus propiconazole, there was a significant reduction. And this was as good as the grower standard. And also we can see the green number again, so we could find again a synergistic effect between both fungicides. When we look into the post-harvest disease or incidence 7 days later, we can see, okay, the incidence of brown rot increased. There's no significant difference anymore between the treatments, only the grower standard was a little better. But again, we had also a very high disease pressure. And we still think that's a very interesting finding. And we can say, okay, howler plus a supplemental dose of propiconazole led to a significant reduction of brown rot and also to synergistic effects under lab and field conditions, at least for first experiments and for first-year field trials. So we need to repeat this. But as usual in research, when you get some interesting findings, there are new questions that you need to answer. And in this case, what impact does the combination of BCAs with a low dose of DMIs has on the resistance development of monolinear fructicola? Because we don't want to increase the resistance in our field populations. And when we talk about resistance in monolinear fructicola, we heard already about this today. We know, okay, the main type in the southeastern United States that are the isolates that include the monoelement, and this is an overexpression of the target gene CYP51. So you must imagine the fungi produces a specific protein what can be bound by the DMI fungicide. So if you have a resistant isolate, the fungi just produce more of the specific protein, and the fungicide, the DMI fungicide, cannot bind everything. So you actually need to increase the dose of the DMI to control the fungi. So with this knowledge, we found a very interesting study that was done in China. And they could figure out, okay, in this case, a BCA Bacillus subtilis could significantly reduce the expression level of the CYP51 target gene in a different pathogen, Osteolagonidea virens, that's a pathogen in rice. And you can see here this H158 is in this case the Bacillus. They're used with another DMI, the tebuconazole, and the combination, and we can see, okay, Bacillus, and also when you combined Bacillus with tebuconazole, significantly reduced the expression level of the target gene. So that's very interesting, and we thought, okay, let's see if we can find similar results for monolinear. So therefore, the question, can we see similar results? And also in this case, in this study, they just worked with one sensitive isolate. So the other question was, can we see differences between sensitive and resistant monolinear isolates? Because it could be that this just works for sensitive isolates. So I started my studies, and I used 2 sensitive and 2 resistant monolinear isolates that were cultivated in PDB. And I added a dose of 0.3 ppm propiconazole, howler, and the combination propiconazole plus howler. Then I extracted the RNA, and I made a transcription of the cDNA and ran a qPCR. And with this, I calculated the expression level of the CYP51 target gene. And this is what we can see here for the sensitive isolates. You can see what we would expect when we treat an isolate of monolinear fructicola with a low dose of propiconazole, the expression level, and this is the white bar, increases. And also we can see there's a significant reduction when we treated the isolate with howler. So that indicates us, okay, howler would not only increase the expression level, we have also less of the target protein, so the DMI fungicide probably could bind everything. And we would be able to control this. The question is, can we see the same effect for resistant isolates? And in this case, we can. So this figure looks pretty similar to the sensitive isolates, and again, we can see that howler significantly reduced the expression level of the CYP51 target gene, and actually, this BCA could help us to manage resistance, or to manage already resistant isolates. So with this, I'm almost at the end, and the take-home messages are BCAs in combination with a sublingual dose of DMI fungicides is a promising approach for brown knot control that allows us to reduce the amount of chemical fungicides, but also to integrate biocontrol agents. And again, we need to do some more studies specifically under field conditions to confirm those first findings. But also BCAs, and in this case specifically howler, can reduce the expression level of the CYP51 target gene in monolinear fructicola, and this can help us to manage resistance against DMIs. So with this, I'm at the end of our presentation, and we would be glad to take any questions that you have.
All right, we're shifting gears, Brett. Don't trip over the cord when you walk up here. We've got Brett Blau, entomologist with UGA in Clemson.
Yeah, so I planned this talk way before chlorpyrifos had been changed, so a lot of this is alternatives. It's still very, very, very relevant, so thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. And it actually this will be a nice little kind of siding with both with these new towards the green movement, but also making sure that we still have some of our more conventional management. So it's kind of nice to come after Johanna and Guido here. All right, so I'm talking about pest management update, but it's really going to be focusing on alternatives to chlorpyrifos. So a little bit of chlorpyrifos update. As you probably already know, back in March of 2022, the EPA revoked all tolerances for use of chlorpyrifos on food products. However, that still allowed us to use chlorpyrifos on things that were non-bearing, at least for 1 year. So we still had a use for it, but in reality, many of the producers of chlorpyrifos decided to take it away, primarily because California already said, well, no matter what, we're done with it. So we still had that use, but it was very hard to use because it was hard to get. However, this past November, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals said that the EPA was overzealous in their decision to revoke all food tolerances of chlorpyrifos, so they overturned the EPA's decision. All right, so that actually allowed us now to use chlorpyrifos again. There's going to be a lot more of courtroom battles for chlorpyrifos, but right now we're kind of in this gray area where we still can use chlorpyrifos. The expectation, though, is that the EPA is going to go back and change the way that they have worded the tolerance revocation, but really what it comes down to is that in the rule there was 11 crops that they decided that they were going to return the use for. Alfalfa, apple, asparagus, cherry, citrus, cotton, and peach is on that. So right now we are in that gray area where it's still legal, and it will likely remain legal at least for peach and these other 10 crops. What I don't see on there are nectarines and plums. I'm not sure exactly how that's all going to work out. So there's a lot more, like I said, battles going to happen in the court system before we get a full understanding of what this all means. But right now, we should be good. This does come back to if any of the chemical companies have already said that they were not going to continue to produce chlorpyrifos. EPA is holding them to that. So anything that's already been subject to cancellation is not legal. But if they had not canceled that product, we are still able to use it. Unfortunately, chlorpyrifos is still going to be under registration, so anything could happen within this next year or two. So I'll make sure to keep everyone up to date on the blog as much as I can as I hear new things taking place. So what this really does mean is, again, we can use it if you can find it. If you have access to current stock, you're good to go. But really what it comes down to is we don't really know what the future of chlorpyrifos is going to be for the production of peaches, at least in the Southeast. So we really kind of want to plan for the future. This will likely mean that some of our previous management plans and the ones that we might even be doing this year are going to change. And those two main pests that we're using chlorpyrifos for are San Jose scale. Regardless of the loss of chlorpyrifos, we still have insect growth regulators that work really well. Again, they're very expensive, but they still work in many ways better than chlorpyrifos did. But we want to look at other options. What are our options for scale beyond those insect growth regulators? The other big one are going to be the borers, so Petri borer and lesser Petri borer. Big one for chlorpyrifos use. What are we going to do? We have mating disruption, which I'll talk a little bit about, as well as entopathogenic nematodes. But again, we really would need a chemical so that we have some alternatives there. So I'll talk about some chemicals that I've been testing to replace that chlorpyrifos. So let's start off with San Jose scale. Just quickly, I've talked about San Jose scale a million times. Our biggest problem here is that those adults and maturing immatures live under a protective coating. So a lot of our conventional insecticides don't really work with them. We've been using dormant oils to suppress them for years, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, the dormant oils seem to not really continue to suppress them to a population that is beneficial for us. A lot of that is the females just reproduce like crazy, so if we lose or miss some of those first management of the scale, a few females on those trees can quickly ramp up and become a huge problem late in the season. And then having a late season population will roll over into the following season and just become a huge problem until we start seeing fruit like this that are just covered, trees dying, limbs dying. It's a disaster. So this past season, we were looking at some other chemicals, looking at some of different oil rates to see what we can do for managing San Jose scale. Here we have different rates of dam oil. 1.5%, which is our general recommendation rate in the guide, but then doubling that at our delayed dormant application to 3% to see if we can improve that management. And then looking at trace oil, which is a more refined oil spray at 1%, 2%, and 4%. And then looking at carbaryl with a pH of 6, because the higher the pH for carbaryl, the longer the residual, and 6 has about a 30-day residual. And then we also have a new label for Brigade in peaches, so that's the bifenthrin product, looking at Brigade at a delayed dormant timing. So both carbaryl and Brigade do not have any oil applications. These were just standard applying that at the delayed dormant timing without an oil. Then we had some targeting those crawler generation in early spring, so this was in April, using that Brigade to target those crawlers, and then lime sulfur. Previous years I've had really good success with lime sulfur targeting the delayed dormant. We were just trying to see what would happen if we were targeting those crawlers. And basically with that lime sulfur, it's just a very rough product on the scale. It kills it. It also potentially has issues with phytotoxicity, but we're curious to see what happens in the spring. And then we've done a lot of work in the past with Movento. Movento is a great systemic insecticide for San Jose scale. Here we're doing a rotation with Savanto. Savanto, we were targeting the delayed dormant timing. So I have two different timings here, the March 1st, which was the delayed dormant with that Savanto, and then April 3rd was targeting later in the season when we had actually foliage on the trees, which you need for that Movento to be taken up into the tree to target those scale. So then we applied that Movento later in April. The Savanto 300 SL is actually systemic. We applied that to the soil. So it's comparing a foliar spray to a soil application. All right, and then we monitor those San Jose scales. So if you haven't seen, we just put these tapes on the tree. It has a double-sided tape, so we can come back, the little crawlers get stuck to the tape, and then we can count the crawlers. This was from 2019, where we had a huge outbreak of San Jose scale. You'll see that the crawlers this year was not quite abundant as that, which is good. All right, so what we found, looking at those delayed dormant timings here, we have our untreated control, which we did nothing to, no oil, no nothing. We have our 5 different oil treatments, DAM oil at 1.5%, DAM oil at 3%, the trace oil 1, 2, and 4, and our carbaryl and brigade. And what we really see here is that DAM oil at 3%, the trace oil at 2%, and 4%, and carbaryl were the only ones that actually significantly suppressed the San Jose scale on those trees compared to our untreated control. Our DAM oil at 1.5% at 100 gallons per acre, which I've shown sadly at numerous times, if you apply that pre-pruning, you're not going to get the effective control of San Jose scale. And again, we weren't seeing that. But when we went up to that 3%, we did get that significant reduction. So if you're applying the oils to the trees that have not been pruned, we really need to either up the gallonage or up the rates to get that suppression. Same with the trace oil at 2 and 4%. And then carbaryl, which is really nice, we're still seeing that as effective as managing San Jose scale as a delayed dormant timing. When we look at our crawlers, I skipped over brigade. So bifenthrin. I was hoping would be a silver bullet for us. I had never tried bifenthrin before for San Jose scale. I was like, this would be a great alternative to chlorpyrifos. As a delayed dormant timing, we did not see that. It was no different than our control, which was very, very frustrating. But what was nice is that brigade, when applied targeting those crawlers, we did see a significant reduction in those crawler numbers, which is really nice because brigade is a pyrethroid. It's going to target a lot of our other pests, so we'll have some multiple targets there so we can get more bang for our buck, which with a lot of our pyrethroids do not have a long enough residual to actually target our crawlers. So this brigade, when applied targeting the crawlers within the season, seems to be effective. So that was good news. Lime sulfur was not, there's nothing really, not worth applying during the season targeting those crawlers. The Movento with the Savanto, both of them, the soil applied and the foliar applied worked very well, both of them significantly reducing those crawlers throughout the season. So it is really nice here. We have several options, increasing our oil percentages, applying brigade during the season, or that Savanto and Movento both work well. So it's nice to see that some of these products are going to be effective and might be a nice alternative to chlorpyrifos. And then quickly going through, we've also been looking at mating disruption for several years. And this another year we're targeting mating disruption of San Jose scale. Just a quick reminder of what mating disruption is. The females here produce a sex pheromone that attracts those males. The males pick up on that pheromone, follow that cue to the female. They mate, reproduce, and we get those crawlers. The crawlers go off, they settle, they develop. Females then attract in more males, and et cetera, getting huge populations within the season. So what we can do is put out these synthetic pheromone dispensers, creating these giant plumes of pheromone. These males come in still looking for that female, and he just gets so confused. He either finds fake females or he just gets frustrated and gives up and eventually dies because they only live a few days. And so they can't mate. Without mating, we don't have offspring, right? So we're not killing them directly, but we're stopping them from reproducing. And so we've done this several years. Last year we tried 2 different brands. These are both still in experimental development. But one was Isomate, which is a twist tie up here. The other is a Trace A puzzle piece, which is over here. You just clip it onto the tree. Both of those dispense the pheromone. We tested at different rates. The Isomate we tested at 50 per acre, 100 per acre, 200 per acre, 400 per acre, and 800 per acre. And then the Trace A, we did 50, 100, and 150. Again, we monitored for those crawlers here. We see these tiny little dots. That's more of what we were seeing this past season. Looking at that Isomate, which is really nice, we were seeing nice suppression of those populations throughout those different rates. Significant reduction even at 50% or 50 of those dispensers per acre. Previous results showed that at a higher population, that 50 per acre was not sufficient. So at a really low population, 50 dispensers per acre significantly reduced those. But really that 100 to 200 per acre seems to be the sweet spot. So this is something we're going to continue to look at to make sure we can get that narrowed down so we have the right rate. Looking at the Trace A results, this is a different dispenser, but the same at a 50 and 100 per acre. We were significantly reducing the number of crawlers in those plots. But again, previous results showed that about that 100 per acre was going to be the sweet spot for Trace A. Both of these are still in experimental stages, but we're hopefully going to bring them, or not we, they will hopefully bring them to market, and we can test them on a larger scale. No pun intended there. All right, quick summary. Scale, really, their dormant oil sprays are still very important. Right? So even though I said that 1.5% wasn't suppressing them, without that we're going to have a real hard time keeping on top of our scale populations. So what I'm recommending though is that if you're doing that pre-prune timing, to either up the gallonage or up the rate of oil so that we get that coverage and effective management of the scale. If you do it post-pruning, previous results have shown that you can reduce that rate back down to 100 gallons per acre at 1.5%. So depending on what the trees are looking at when you're doing your oil sprays for delayed dormant timing, you have a few choices there. Also, we can add in insecticides to improve that delayed dormant timing. Esteem, Centaur, and Venerate have all done well at that delayed dormant timing. Carbaryl, I've had several years of good results with Carbaryl. So that's one I'm going to start recommending as well in the management guides. It just seems to work really well. Targeting those crawlers, that Movento and Savanto have been around for a while. They both work well. That Movento is really based on timing. Make sure you have leaves on those trees. Esteem, again, we can do that targeting those crawlers. And bifenthrin, this was the first year I've done it. I need more results to really be able to say I can recommend it, but it was encouraging to see that reduction in that first year. Mating disruption, again, it's still experimental, but it's really encouraging, and hopefully we can do more with that in the future. All right, borers. So the first thing we're doing is looking at some of our chemical options. Back in September of 2022, I put out our trial sprays here and then came back in April 2023 to evaluate them, looking for wounds. What we did, we tested here 7 different ones with various insecticidal groups, including neonics, pyrethroids, diamide, insect growth regulator, another pyrethroid, and then a combo, and then compare that to Lorsban. So we have Asail, Asana, Alticor, Ryman, Mustang Max, and Cormoran. When we look at our results here, what we're looking at are the wounds per tree. This is just Petri borer. Strangely, this was done in Watkinsville. Our plots did not have any lesser Petri borer damage. So that was frustrating, but we did get this Petri borer damage, so we have some results here. And actually, the Asail, Alticor, and Cormoran all worked really well. We saw a significant reduction in wounds on all 3 of those. And Lorsban, for whatever reason, did not perform very well in this. It was no different than our control. But overall, the wounds were very low, and there was a lot of variation. But we still can pull out that Asail, Alticor, and Cormoran were very good. So that's encouraging. And since I didn't have any lesser results. I reached out to one of my colleagues at Michigan State University, and he had done a similar trial, but this is in cherries, but he was looking for lesser peach tree borer as well. He looked at Lorsban again, but Assail, Rhymin, Asana, and Alticore, so similar to what I was looking at. And, sorry, one more. Lorsban performed very well for them for lesser peach tree borer, as well as Alticore. So Alticore seems to be that overlapping one where we're getting effective suppression of lesser peach tree borer and peach tree borer. And Lorsban, now that it's back, again, definitely worked very well for lesser. And I imagine it's still going to be a good one for peach tree borer. So we repeated that this year. This year I added in carbaryl as another treatment and bifenthrin to see what bifenthrin will do for the borers. All right, I'm not going to spend too much time on these alternative methods for peach tree borer, but I just want to remind you that there are some of these alternatives that we're continuing to work on to make them more practical for our large-scale production. So these entomopathogenic nematodes, these are good nematodes. They are produced commercially. So BASF has a product, this Nemesis C, and BioBee. These are specific species. The Steiner Nema carpocapsi is one that targets our borers. It's really good at suppressing Lepidopteran pests. And what's great about these commercial products is that they can be applied with our standard equipment. You can use the same sprayer that you use for chlorpyrifos, as long as you remove any sort of filter or mesh that's in there, because those filters are basically razor wire for a tiny little worm. But other than that, you can spray them, you can put them through irrigation, you can pour them. They're very, very versatile. What's really nice about them is that they can be preventative and curative. So if you apply them in the fall, just like chlorpyrifos, they can be preventative. And previous results from David Shapiro, Alon's lab have shown that when you compare them to doing nothing, nothing gets you high percent of infestation, which is what we would expect. If you apply those nematodes, you get a significant reduction in your infestation. That's great. Now, if we actually compare them to some results with chlorpyrifos as a curative, chlorpyrifos, in this case, actually was no different than our control, looking at peach tree borer, but applying those nematodes with different styles, handgun, trunk, and watering can, all significantly reduce the damage. Now, the biggest problem with the nematodes is that you need moisture. The soil needs to be moist so that the nematodes don't desiccate. These are free-living little organisms. They need water to survive. If they don't have water, they die. So David has done a lot of work with using this fire-retardant gel, Barricade 2, and the Barricade does a really good job at keeping those nematodes alive. However, Barricade is extremely expensive. It's hard to work with. It is a nightmare to mix into water. I'll just say it's a nightmare. I don't want to talk bad about it. It works well, but it's a nightmare to use. So I have a graduate student that came on, and she's like, this sounds really cool. I want to try this because we potentially can use these nematodes for lesser peach tree borer, but Barricade is not going to be worthwhile because it's a nightmare. So she was looking at food-safe gels, comparing those to Barricade. So we have this carboxymethyl cellulose, xanthan gum, locust bean gum, and sodium alginate. Half those I'd never heard of before, but most of them are found in everyday foods, or in some of them are fancy foods. But she looked at different percentages that we can easily mix into water and apply through a sprayer. She then took those and mixed them with that Steiner Nema carpocapsi nematode and put those under UV to see whether or not the gels can protect those nematodes. And then she took the nematode gel and made these poor little wax worms get covered in that gel to see whether the nematodes will actually kill those wax worms. Sadly, we don't have any of the peach tree borer to test in the lab or lesser peach tree borer to test in the lab because they'll decimate an orchard, but when you try to bring them into a lab setting, they're a nightmare to work with. It's frustrating, to say the least. Anyway, Can they kill waxworms? All right, so yeah, so after 3 hours of exposure, pretty much everything is killing those waxworms. If we look at oops, I went too far. At 6 hours, we're still killing the waxworms. But then at 8 hours, we're seeing whether or not the nematodes are killing those waxworms. And only the barricade gel, the locust bean gum, and that sodium alginate had significantly higher mortality of those waxworms from the nematodes compared to the other gels, including the water and the control here with no nematodes. And so this is really encouraging. Granted, when we spray this into the field, it's going to be out there for a lot longer than 8 hours. But what we're seeing is that these food-safe, relatively cheap, and easy to work with gels are working just as well as barricade. All right, so we can then, our next step is to take this to the field to see whether or not we can kill those field populations of Petri borer and lesser Petri borer. All right, so we already covered that. Last, just a couple minutes, the mating disruption. So mating disruption, Ted Cottrell and Dan Horton had been working on that for borers for a very long time. Unfortunately, early on in the process, they didn't the mating disruption didn't really work for us in the Southeast. But thankfully, with their hard work and working with CBC America, they've now developed a new product, or relatively new, the Isomate LPTB Plus. This is formulated specifically for the Southeast, more specifically for Georgia and South Carolina. It works to suppress both Petri borer and lesser Petri borer. You put these twist ties out in the orchard early spring, and it lasts all season for stopping the mating, just like with the San Jose scale. A new product from Trace will hopefully be out in the market soon as well. We'll have some competition there and hopefully reduce the prices, because that's the biggest problem right now with mating disruption. I just wanted to update you though. Last year we worked on a small trial in South Carolina. A lot of this work had been done in Georgia and Alabama, so we've set up a trial in South Carolina looking at the mating disruption. We did about 200 acres, 150 dispensers per acre, and compared that to an organic control. And so we monitored both the adults, and then late in the season we looked for any damage from them. And I should mention that I only did the damage, all their work was done by Sarah Scott. I just kind of jumped in and stole her data to present to you, so thanks so much to Sarah for making sure this all got done. And then looking at late in the season, looking at that damage. So for Petri borer, this is our control. It was organic control compared to our mating disruption. So this is all the percent of trees that were damaged. So this is very small scale. We just counted 10 trees in these different blocks. But on a 10-tree sample, on the organic, we were getting almost 20% of those trees had damage, whereas in our mating disruption, it was only really about 2.5%, which actually ends up being only one tree. We only saw one tree in our disruptive that had damage. Looking at lesser Petri borer, it was about 22% of those trees had damage, and we didn't find a single one that had damage in our mating disruption. So this is really encouraging. One big caveat is that I did not explore to see whether or not that damage had active wounds or they're still reproducing there. This was more of just looking at the damage in general. So there's still more work to do, but it's really encouraging to see that the mating disruption is working in South Carolina. All right. Okay, the biggest problem here is that the product cost for mating disruption is still pretty high, but adding in some competition will hopefully drive that down a little bit. And the area-wide approach is still most effective, but some of the work that Ted has done in Alabama and what we're seeing here in South Carolina as well, that it still might work on a smaller scale even if you aren't doing that full area-wide management. All right, Len, I think I have one more slide. Going too fast. sorry, management resources. All right, so the 2024 peach management guides are out now. The online version will be published very soon. I just got the proof from our communications office, so it'll be online soon. But the print guides will be distributed at our various meetings. Peach blog is always there, and the My IPM smartphone app. So we have a lot of information out there for us. And so thanks to all the growers and all the companies who have helped me this past season, and I'm over time. But if you have questions, come see me. I'll be here all day and tomorrow.
All right, good. I'm ready to. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about a nematode survey we did in Georgia. And you would think as long as we've been growing peaches in Georgia, we'd already had a nematode survey. But in reality, we can't find one if we did. But with that, I'll mention, of course, we know a lot about nematodes. So it's not like we don't know a little bit about what's growing there. But as far as where they're growing and if there are any differences that we need to be aware of, we did not have that information. A lot of work went into this. Jeff did a lot of helping us out getting the locations, and then Ted Holliday obviously did a lot of the actual sampling. We had folks running the samples. So this is a joint effort from a lot of people. I won't mention everybody, but it's not just me doing this. It is a tremendous amount of effort to do these kind of surveys. I know that y'all feel like this some days. You got a lot of things to deal with, and nematodes is just one of them. But it's a very important one to keep that finger in the dike, because it is definitely one that will take you out of production pretty quickly if you don't do it well. As far as the basics, I mean, I know most of y'all are going to know what a nematode is, but it is a parasitic worm, lives in the ground predominantly, and they eats the roots of the plant. And that's what we deal with. As far as nematicides, we have looked at quite a few post-plant nematicides. We have yet to find one, even on the newer products that are coming to market, that I'm ready to recommend to you. I just have not seen the results out of the post-plant nematicides that I would like to see. We're still very dependent on fumigants, and these fumigants, again, you apply them prior to planting. Most of them work through a vapor or a water phase to get into and kill nematodes, and so we don't have as many of them as we used to, but we do still have some, and they work pretty well. As far as our challenges with peach production, it's a perennial crop. Unlike vegetables, we're here at the vegetable conference, you can't rotate out of this very easily. You put the peach in the ground, it's going to be there hopefully for about 15 years. But those nematodes then are going to build up over that time, and as I've told you, you don't have any post-plant nematicides, so whatever you do up front, selection of rootstock or fumigation is going to be important for the life of the orchard. And we do have only fumigation and rootstock really. And so I've already told you these post-plant things aren't working particularly well. The predominant nematodes we've always talked about mainly have been ring nematode and root knot. We've not talked about lesion probably as much as we should have, to be honest. And I'll show you why in a second. But ring, root knot, lesion are the three that we predominantly worry about. As far as the root knot, what it does, it forms these galls on the roots. That's why it's called root knot nematode. And it does do some other things to the plant, though. It alters the host physiology of the plant. That can result in all kinds of bad things happening. So you low fruit yield, poor fruit quality, tree decline, and eventual death if you've got enough of it. You can see young trees that will never make it beyond 2 years with nematode damage if you've got the wrong rootstock and a high enough population. They will completely die. And you can also get crown gall. So that's yet another thing. So bacterial disease will come in on top and form even bigger knots. This is just showing you some of the symptoms here. Stunting on a 1-year-old peach tree. Again, you can actually have these trees never grow out beyond that if you have a sufficient nematode population. And of course, you can have the root galling that will occur. Here's a close-up showing you a little bit more what those galls can look like. I've actually seen it a lot worse than that. So it can be much more significant than that, but that's pretty bad. Ring nematodes. Okay, these are the other one that we talk about that we really try to address with the fumigation and also the rootstock, but these destroy the feeder roots. Probably the more important thing is that they predispose the plant to other diseases and especially peach tree short life. So you can get trees that are less vigorous, less tolerant to drought stress, all the things you'd expect with a lot of nematodes on the roots, But the peach tree short life is the real big thing that we're concerned about. That's a ring nematode. And if you look at it, you can see all the rings. That's why they call it a ring nematode. So I'll keep things pretty simple. But that's about as much as I know about nematodes. I can see the rings on that one. As far as the peach tree short life, I do want to mention this and go over some of the points on it. We talk about it, but we haven't had a really good conversation about it in a while that I remember. And it really is the nematode that predisposes you to peach tree short life. So what is this? It's a stress-related disease. Again, the peach tree short life is caused by or associated with the ring nematode. There are lots of other factors, but the nematodes are very much part of the equation, if not the major part of the equation associated with this particular disease. It brings on cold damage, which then allows the Pseudomonas to come in, and that's what actually ends up killing the tree. But the nematode is the part of it that changes the physiology of the plant that allows that cold damage to come in, or at least that's the theory. Okay, so it's very important. That nematode, if you keep it from happening, you're much less likely to have peach tree short life. So that's what it looks like as far as in the tree itself. If you have it and the tree dies, can't get my, well, that thing is, there it is. If you have it, you're going to have suckers that come up, because if you look down below, it's actually alive below, but it's been killed by the cold damage with the Pseudomonas above. You can sometimes see this Pseudomonas and the effect that it has on the scaffold limbs, and there oftentimes will be that kind of a bacterial smell associated with that. And this is just some of the trials down in Byron, just to show you that if you don't have resistance built in, you're going to lose your trees pretty quickly. Hence peach tree short life. So that's what that is. The other thing too, in addition to peach tree short life, if you have the nematodes, it can increase bacterial spot. So there's a known association with bacterial spot as well. So another indirect type thing, but caused by a nematode. The things to do for peach tree short life, and again, I'll go through these quickly, but the main thing is to maintain the soil health for the plant. So you've got to look at your pH, you need a subsoil, fumigate when the nematodes are part of the problem there, use a nematode-free planting stock, appropriate root stock, soil foliar testing, and go back to maintaining just the general health of the tree. Pruning is important too. Prune after February 1st, discontinue summer pruning by 15 September. Avoid mechanical cultivation so you don't damage the roots and the trunk. And then post-plant nematicides, which we don't have. It would be nice if we did. And then destroying dead and dying trees and getting them out of there. Okay, so that's just the 10-point peach tree short life program that was developed probably 30 years ago at least. And so it's been around for a while, but it's still important to remember that. Root lesion nematodes. I said we don't talk about these enough. All right, they feed on the cortex of the root, they damage, destroy the roots, and eventually they're going to stunt the tree and they're going to produce a small root system. I'm going to show you some data later on what that actually looks like, size of the tree-wise. But here's just some stuff in the literature. Again, you can kind of see, obviously that's a smaller tree where you have the lesion nematode, same thing in a lab trial. That's what it looks like. But the main thing is it's going to make a smaller tree that's less productive, and I think it will eventually kill it too. I don't think it just is less productive. It can kill the tree if you have enough of these. And there, it actually goes inside the root system itself. It gets inside, so it's not just on the outside. So you can see that thing crawling around. You know that's going to be some major damage, and then you're going to get other things coming in on those root systems that are going to take out the tree. So it's a dangerous one. Dagger, I'm a little bit less concerned about, but it can be a problem. And so I'm going to give you some data on dagger, but it can transmit viruses. I don't think that we have a major problem with tomato ring spot virus in peaches. Libby's going to be talking about viruses tomorrow, and this is not one that came up in the survey, but it can do that. But it can also just cause some direct damage also. So it's not an insignificant nematode. I think with the other stuff we're doing to control lesion, ring, and root knot, we're less likely to have a major problem with dagger, and I'll show you that also in a minute. I know you can't really see that data set, but what I wanted to point out, this is an old data set. This actually comes from research that was done before I was born. And I actually knew some of the people when I first started in plant pathology at Georgia. They were still alive, still working. And so I actually did know them. It dates me too, though. So, but just to show you, even in 1961, we already had these same nematodes showing up. So that's lesion, dagger, ring, and root knot are on that chart. And that's some of their data they were getting in the Athens area doing fumigation trials back in those days. So it's been around for a while, and we've known something. Just by doing the survey, it's not that we've learned everything. I mean, we already knew some stuff. Boy, that came up different than I thought it would. I don't know what happened there. It went completely jumbled on this computer. Jeff, where are you? I'm going to blame that on you. But anyhow, this is what we did. This is a systematic survey. And we conducted it in 2022, 4 to 8 year old trees, so we're not looking at new trees and doing this. 49 orchards, 16 counties, 10 samples per orchard, 490 samples total, so quite a few. The samples consisted of 4 soil cores per tree. Again, a lot of work went into this. We used the sucrose flotation method. We enumerated and identified the nematodes. And then we identified these to particular regions. NTS, who's in the audience, raise your hand. He actually helped us to identify the species, a few of these as well. So we've gotten this down to a pretty good level as far as what we're trying to do. I'm just going to see what's going to happen on the next slide. Now I'm going to be surprised. These green, I hope y'all can see that green on that background, but those are all the different locations where we took samples, okay? So that's a pretty comprehensive north to south survey. And again, we've had a lot more peaches in the past in Georgia, but I think this gives us a good idea, a snapshot in time of where we are now, and it's probably where we've always been when you really get right down to it. Obviously, things change a lot from north to south, and you would expect maybe the nematode population would change north to south. I mean, we've got, if you want to look at the geologic map or just the elevation map, which will be an impact on temperature and other things, very, very different north to south. And that's one of the things we wanted to look at and see, well, do we have the same nematodes everywhere? What do we actually have? And again, I told you this has not been done before. So we kind of broke this down. We looked at different maps and tried to figure out how we're going to break this down. And in the end, this is what we settled on. We said we were going to, and these are the counties here. This is the Blue Ridge, is Fannin, Gilmer counties, Upper Piedmont, Banks and Hall. Lower Piedmont is Clark and Crawford. Crawford also has a split right through the middle, so it occurs in the lower and the upper coastal plain. Upper coastal plain is Bleckley, Crawford, Macon, Peach, and Taylor, and then lower coastal plain is Brooks, Colquitt, Tattnall, and Tift. So if you're from those counties, you'll know what we're talking about as far as your location. But that's how we broke it down to look at this. I know you can't see that. I'm not going to make you look at that. That's the good news. But that's the results of the survey looking at just a few of the nematodes. We got a lot more nematodes out of this than here, but they didn't amount to much. So I'm not showing you that data. And I'm going to also ignore stunt. Stunt is in there, but it wasn't that significant, so we're just going to leave it off. I'm going to go back to the ones that really count. All right, so this is now looking at ring. All right, so if you look at this, oh, one more thing. Let me tell you what this is, going back here to the bottom. So if you look at the PF, that's the percent frequency. That's basically the percent of times that the nematode occurred. The abundance is if you had the nematode in a site, that's how high the count was on average for where you had it. And then the maximum is just the maximum count we got from all the sites. So you can go, that's the maximum number we got. So that's what we're looking at when we go through this thing. All right, so that's what PF, AB, and MD are. But the main thing, ring. You can kind of see the take-home on this. It's pretty prevalent almost everywhere. You go north to south, starting at the top is north and then going down to the bottom is south. You've got a lot of ring. The percentages are not always so high for our location, but your maximum densities, I mean, you're going up into the several hundred sometimes with these counts. Now, these are on, a lot of these trees are on guardian rootstock, and they've also been fumigated. And yet we're getting those higher counts. So that tells you something. These numbers do go up over time. All right, here's lesion. Okay, and I'll say this again, NTS has told us these are all the Pratylincus vulnus. We had several samples we sent in. There are multiple different kinds of lesions, but that's all we're finding so far. Again, the take home on this is look at how often this occurs. If you look at the percentages, the PF column, especially in middle Georgia and down into South Georgia, but there's a lot of high percentages. That means a lot of our farms have lesion there. And so that's important. It may diminish a little bit as you go north, but there's still a lot of it up there. And you look at some of the counts on the right here, that maximum density, the MD, there's a lot of lesion in some of these sites. So it's pretty significant that we have that much of that. Dagger, not as high of counts for sure. If you look at the counts, the percentage of times, it's pretty often. It's also occurring, especially when you get up further, maybe a little bit further north, we have more of it. It does seem to diminish a little bit in the south. That's the type of information we wanted to gain out of this. But the main thing is it's out there, but I'm not too concerned about it because I think we're going to kill it. It's going to get caught in the crossfire from killing these other nematodes. Root knot, this is interesting to me because we had very, very little root knot. And I'm going to show you these few right here that we found. If you look at the numbers, well, I cannot get that thing to go. Here we go. If you look at the numbers, here's one site. Most of the numbers coming in on these high counts here are from one site. Now, that was a fumigated site on Lovell, and it's Meloidogon javanica was the nematode that was there. But that's mainly coming out of one site. I wouldn't be too surprised that we had a pretty high count on Lovell. That did not surprise me. These other two sites, and again, this is mainly two sites we're looking at. We have these high counts. Most of that's coming from two sites. These numbers, these high numbers are certainly from those sites. This was a non-fumigated Guardian site. We had high counts on 5 samples out of that site, but it's Meloidogon incognita. And the reason we wanted to speciate these, and India has helped us to do that, is because there could be these other nematodes like the Floridensis or something that's starting to move a little bit. And when you have high counts like that, you got to wonder. This one in particular down here, it was also non-fumigated Guardian, Meloidogon javanica, and it had high counts in all 10 of the samples we took. So it was very high and very consistent. So the question arises, well, why did we have those counts if those are nematodes that should be controlled with the Guardian or suppressed with the Guardian? I think the most logical thing is it could have been either one or two things. Either there was a mistake in what was shipped in the shipment to the producer, or the producer misidentified this as Guardian rootstock. So we don't see a lot of that. The good news is when you look, Greg, you got another?
Guardian is not as resistant to javanica, okay? So that's what surprises me. Okay. The second thing, though, with root knot, Guardian does get galled, but you have to look at egg. You need to count egg masses, and that's, I don't know if that was done or not. But on a very heavy side of javanica, Guardian is not as resistant, like partially resistant. Then getting back to the ring nematode, did you key it out? Did you key it out to try to key it out to species or not?
We did not on ring.
Okay, thing with ring nematode, I worked with Andy for many years. We did a lot of sampling. Give Andy Bermuda grass nearby.
Oh, I know.
You're going to have ornata.
Yeah.
So it was very critical when you took samples not to have any vegetation.
That was one of the things that Ted did. So he knows that too. And so he tried to take samples from places, well, he did. I shouldn't say he tried to. He took samples from non-weed areas. So this would be clear soil.
It's very easy to get a lot of ring that's not seen.
Yeah. No, I think we're hitting the ring pretty correctly. No, we didn't speciate it, but I think we're hitting it right.
And with Guardian rootstock, you will have ring. You'll have a lot of ring, but it doesn't affect the side quite as much.
Yeah. And I'll move on if I have time, though. I want to go back to this because I have questions too. I told you I'm going to ask you questions at the end, so that's how we're going to do that. But anyway, that's what we got. But the bottom line is, not a lot of problem with root knot by comparison to what you might think. We're doing something right, I think, because we're getting less, the combination of the rootstock, fumigation, not nearly as much of a problem with root knot as I would have thought throughout the state. So pretty good result on root knot. If you look at, this is Guardian specifically, and just breaking this down, and just giving you some of the numbers. There's nothing really there that stands out that you would not expect. I mean, if you look at the root knot, it's low, and the other, the lesion you'd expect to be high, as well as the ring. So nothing that really stands out. It appears to be doing what it's supposed to be doing. Fumigated, non-fumigated, again, if you look at ring or lesion, and these are older trees, they're almost identical. The numbers are amazingly the same. But I can tell you that there's still a benefit to fumigation. I'll show you that in a second. It's just the numbers come back up over time. Dagger, again, not so worried about dagger. The fumigation is probably going to help with dagger long term. It does have an impact on dagger. And then root knot, fumigation, I mean, these are not substantially different numbers, but again, I think you get a response with the fumigation on the root knot. So just showing you that data from the survey. All right, going back to this again, from this, looking at and again, you can't see these numbers, but this was a fumigation trial. And what it showed in part was that with the good fumigants, you could have a major impact on the dagger nematode for a long period of time. I think this next slide you can see, this is from grape in Washington State, but this is fumigation with not a particularly good fumigant, just Vapam. And over time, this is several years, but you can see those red bars, all those zeros going across there. That's the impact on dagger. So fumigation knocks the heck out of dagger, and it doesn't have a lot of generations in a year. It only has like one generation per year or something like that on average. So therefore, it's not going to build up real quick. So that's why I tell you, when I'm not overly concerned about dagger, I don't want to ignore it. But I think if we do the right thing, it's not going to be that important to us. So just to present that data. All right, so here's what our results are. So you have highly variable nematode numbers by location, which is kind of what we would expect. Root knot is a little bit more consistently found in the coastal plain, but again, it's hard to take anything home on these root knots. There's just not a lot of them. It's not that prevalent, which is great. That's a good thing. We're doing something right. Dagger and ring nematodes are relatively prevalent throughout Georgia. Lesion is abundant in the coastal plain of lower Piedmont, but essentially, again, we can find it anywhere. So we need to be doing nematode sampling. All the damage in middle nematodes are in middle Georgia. I mean, we just have a little bit of everything. It's a soup of nematodes down there. And we didn't find any strong associations with soil characteristics. We did soil analysis looking at the texture of the soil and various components of the soil. We didn't find any associations that are strong enough that we could write home about that. The bottom line is all these nematodes will occur in all the soils that we have in Georgia. And based on what I've seen and taken samples over the years, I would attest to that as well. So why do we have problems with nematode damage? First of all, if we don't nematode test, it's so important that we take the test and go ahead and make sure what we have before we put the trees in the ground. That will tell us what we need to fumigate with. It's certainly going to tell us about root stocks. But nonetheless, it's a tool that we need to take advantage of, and we need the nematode test more often probably. The time to do that is in February to April and also in September to October. The reason being that gives you different counts on the nematodes that's going to give you a better assessment either of ring, root knot, and root lesion nematodes, okay? So you really need to sample twice before you're planting your trees in the following year. Pretty much fumigation, if you have the nematodes present, and it may be something tying into what Greg's saying, even with the guardian rootstock, you might get a benefit out of fumigation as well, because you do build up some level of some of these nematodes. If you have lesion, you've got to fumigate, because we don't have any resistance in any of the rootstocks to lesion nematode. So that's a real problem for us. Dagger, the same thing, but again, I've already told you I'm not as concerned. So treating with nematicides, I think generally, and I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but a 6 to 8 foot strip is probably what most people are putting down. That's probably what I would do if I was trying to grow peaches commercially. I can't say that, you know, the old recommendations are if you have a lot of nematodes, you probably need to fumigate the entire field, like wall-to-wall fumigation. The cost on that would be exorbitant now with the cost of fumigants. And I really think a 6 to 8 foot strip, based on my experience, based on most of what people are doing, is fine. And that seems to be the standard that we're going with. Telone is still the best product around. It's really what you got. I mean, you do have Picklor 60 and some other products, but as far as nematodes are concerned, Telone works very effectively and it's still very, very good. This is just some data from some other trials that we've done going back to looking at lesion and dagger. I think you can see some of these numbers here, but this is looking at Telone, C35, Picklor 60 at 2 different rates. This is pre-fumigation, and then this is what we got post-fumigation. That's 54.25 lesion, and we knocked it down to around 2 to 3 with just about all those. So you can really knock it back, and it continues to increase a little bit over time, though, even within the first year. Same thing is true with the dagger, but you don't see quite as much of an increase. You see what I'm saying? The dagger is just a little bit more sensitive. We knock it back well with these fumigants. But here's what I wanted you to really get from this, is the trunk diameter. That is cubic meters, and in the first year, the untreated had 13.35, and most of these are about 5 to 6 more cubic meters. That's a lot of volume, a lot of plant volume. So your tree size is dramatically impacted where you have lesion and dagger by fumigation. Going to the next year, and we've got a third year, but I don't have the data yet on that. But going back and just looking, same site, same situation with the nematodes, and look at your tree volume over here. That's 31.18, and in some cases, over 10 cubic meters difference in tree volume. So the nematode is making a huge difference in the health of that tree with lesion and dagger. So we can't ignore the combination of those two, but especially the lesion. All right, there's some things you can do. You can plant some of these wheats and things like that. You know, if it's a cultural type management, is a pre-plant type thing, that does work on some of the nematodes. So keep that in mind as something you can do for nematode management. And then as far as the rootstocks, and I don't think this is actually exactly right anymore. This is the old information that when Andy Nizipper was here, he provided to me, but I'm not sure that we can trust this now to be the case. And if you look at Floradensis, and this is what I'm keying on there, Floradensis, we have Guardian as being resistant or tolerant.
No, we don't. I don't know what you put that there. That's not true. It's susceptible.
That's what I'm saying. It is susceptible. That's what I'm saying. I don't think that no longer is that the case. So I wouldn't trust that. As far as the Florida Guard, I don't even know that it's that good. I'm not sure that on that.
Genotypes, that's the issue.
Yeah.
It technically should be.
Yep. What I'm telling you is with this table, and I'll put this, it's going to be in the meeting somewhere. You can go access this. I'm not saying this is accurate, but this is what we had told people just a few years ago, and I think it's no longer accurate. The good news so far in Georgia is we've not found it in Georgia, but I think you do have it in South Carolina.
I found it in South Carolina.
So I think that's the problem with that. So keep that in mind when you're picking rootstocks and taking nematode samples. And then this is additional information just to give you some of the differences in the different things that are out there. I think this is relatively still accurate as far as the different resistances, but there are differences in the rootstocks. I think still in my mind, if somebody asked me what to do, I would put out Guardian rootstock. I know that people don't always use Guardian rootstock for every site, but I do think Guardian is still probably the best, most consistent rootstock we have, and we can't get MP29 enough of it most of the time to really help us out. And so Guardian is still the thing that I would recommend, and also consider fumigation as well, especially in light of how many lesion and dagger nematodes we do have out there. Yes, Greg.
For lesions, we have looked at lesions. There's been pretty good studies done on penetrant, which is not, that's the northern lesion. Guardian is actually it posts a fair amount of lesion, but it's actually better than all the other peach rootstocks for lesion. And McHenry looked at it out in California, and once again, it's not great.
Yep.
It's slightly better than, definitely better than level of some of the other peach rootstocks.
Well, that study that I told you about there, where we're looking at the tree volume, That's on Guardian. So it's still, it may be better than, but it still is not good enough.
And as you mentioned, I recommend fumigation, any place you have nematodes, fumigate, and you're only going to get 3 years for it.
Yeah.
By year 3, year 4, they all come back, but the tree gets established and won't die on it.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference based on what I can see. And I'll present more fumigation data later. Yes.
Is it that Guardian was resistant to fluorescence?
It never was. So I don't
Yeah.
know why it would have been.
Well, that was, I know, and that's what I'm saying. I don't, that's not the case. But that's what we had told people probably 10 years ago.
I never told them.
I know, but I did because that's the data I had. So anyway, I'm just telling you, don't trust that chart. It's not correct. All right, I know I'm out of time.
Are there any more questions? I mean, we're at the end of our session. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for making this first session a good one.